Our recently concluded research on funding precarity and women's peace work explored how women's civil society organizations that are engaged in peace work in Colombia, Nepal, and Northern Ireland experience the funding relationships in which they are embedded. Based on our findings, we argue that funding precarity affects peace work in three ways. First, the reduction of available funds tends to lead to short project cycles with a preference for concrete deliverables, which is often at odds with the transformative ethos of women's peace work. Second, the inconsistency of funding can encourage organizations to bid for funds and activities that may be outside of their direct sphere of expertise, and to invest energy in horizontal network and solidarity building with other organizations rather than service delivery. And third, the gradual erosion of funding over time has affected the flexibility and resilience of organizations in the face of further funding shocks, which is illustrated in our study by the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the organizations involved. The study used a qualitative semi-structured interview design. We completed 17 interviews in total. The interviews were transcribed and coded by the team, producing a list of 7 preliminary codes, which we grouped into 3 dominant themes. I briefly discuss each dominant theme in turn. The first theme we identified related to funding dynamics. There was a clear perception conveyed by our interlocutors that funders like to fund tangible things that have easily quantifiable outcomes. This affects the kind of activities that are more likely to attract funding, but also influences the ways that these activities are managed. Some donor imperatives can mean that the actual work that CSOs see as vital to women's continued participation in peace building goes unfunded. CSOs indicated a need for funding things like transport, room hire, and food. These are not expenditures that are necessarily attractive to donors, and yet they're vital for these organizations. Further, we found that the ways in which governments frame conflict and peace has a direct impact on what gets funded and what does not. The question of what peace is and where it is and when it is and who gets to decide the answers to these questions is directly relevant to the funding of on-the-ground peace work. The second theme is organizational dynamics. Some CSOs reported feeling as though they must say the right things or use the right terms and frameworks to appeal to certain donors. However, many also reported the need to keep a strong sense of what their organization is doing and what it is good at, recognizing that there are costs in trying to be everything for everyone. Large established CSOs clearly have an advantage in the pitching or tender process because they usually have a wider remit and the resources to absorb sunk costs in applications for funding that are unsuccessful. It can be very hard for grassroots CSAs to compete. The final theme relates to flexibility and resilience. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted existing tensions in funding relationships. It has created additional stresses for many women as the burden of care labor disproportionately fell to them, and the increased need for many of the services provided by the CSOs with which we spoke. We were told that some funders were supportive and flexible in the face of unanticipated change and others less so. However, these challenges also push some CSOs to reinvent their approach and find other ways to facilitate engagement and maintain community relationships. Our research shows that the engagement of women-led CSOs in peace work faces many challenges. Embedded assumptions about the value of peace work undertaken by women and women-led organizations also challenge the viability of continued efforts towards sustainable peace. Donors, at least those funding the organizations that we spoke to, are not perceived to be prioritizing the everyday necessities identified by our research informants, largely because it's not considered peace work to provide for these needs. This results in CSOs having to make several concessions with regards to funding. Our research suggests an urgent need for donors to reflect on the kinds of activities that are deemed to constitute peace work, to progress efforts towards sustainable peace through this kind of targeted funding.